The warning signs had been floating at the edge of the solar system for 10,000 years. They were enormous metal plates, each one wider than a mountain and taller than a skyscraper. They were fixed in space by technology so old that no living engineer in the galaxy could fully explain how they stayed in place. Each plate was covered in writing deep, carved letters in over 400 languages, spoken across the known galaxy. Some of those languages belonged to empires that no longer existed. Some belonged to species that had gone silent long ago. But every single inscription in every single language said exactly the same thing: do not enter this system, do not disturb the planet within, do not wake what sleeps here, turn around, leave, do not come back. Commander VTH Kalos of the Galactic Dominion read the nearest sign from the bridge of his flagship, tilted his long gray head to one side, and ordered his fleet to move forward. Anyway, he was not a careless creature. By nature, he was in fact quite intelligent. He had earned his rank through years of careful planning and successful campaigns across the outer sectors. He had read history. He knew that the quarantine on this system was ancient, placed here at the end of an era that most modern Dominion citizens thought of as mythology rather than real history, and that was exactly why he was not concerned. Mythology in his experience was just old fear dressed up in dramatic language. Whatever had frightened the people who built these signs was long gone. Thousands of years had passed. The universe had moved on. His fleet consisted of 47 warships of various sizes. They were well-armed, well-crewed, and well-supplied. Their mission was straightforward: reach the third planet. In this quiet system, scan it for valuable mineral deposits and begin the early stages of resource extraction. The Dominion needed materials for its expansion projects. This planet, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Orion arm, had shown promising readings from long-range sensors. The quarantine, VTH Kalos had decided, was an obstacle, and obstacles were meant to be moved past. His science officer, a small and careful creature named Pell, had said nothing. When he gave the order to advance, she had simply turned back to her console and opened the archive file on the system. She had already read it twice that morning. Now she read it a third time, slowly moving through every line. When she reached the final paragraph, the one that described the wake condition, she closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The order had been given. The third planet came into view on the main display, and even Vithalos paused for a moment to look at it. It was genuinely beautiful, blue and green and white, wrapped in slowly turning clouds, glowing softly against the black of space. It looked peaceful. It looked gentle. From this distance, it looked like exactly the kind of quiet, undeveloped world that made for an easy extraction mission. VTH Kalos ordered a standard orbital scan to map the surface geology. The results came back quickly, showing rich mineral deposits spread across several continental regions. He studied the map and selected 3 uninhabited wilderness areas as test targets. Low-level bombardment pulse on each location would confirm the depth and quality of the deposits. Standard procedure, nothing excessive. The pulses fired, they hit the surface with the force of moderate earthquakes, shaking the ground across wide areas. From orbit, the impact looked minor, small, bright flashes in the middle of empty land there and gone in seconds. on the surface of the planet, 10,000 km from the nearest impact point, a human farmer named Dale Hutchins was standing outside his barn when the ground moved. Under his boots, he looked down at the dirt, then looked up at the sky. The horizon was still, the air was still, but the ground had moved in a way that felt wrong, not like a natural tremor, but like something above had pushed downward. Dale squinted at the pale blue afternoon sky for a long moment, then he went inside, sat down at his kitchen table, and turned on the television. He was not the only one who had noticed. Within 3 hours, seismic monitoring stations on 6 continents had logged the impacts. Within 5 hours, military radar systems in 4 countries had detected the fleet in high orbit. Within 8 hours, the information had reached the heads of every major government on the planet. There were emergency meetings. There were urgent phone calls. There were a great many people in important rooms, talking in very serious voices. But here was the thing about the people on this small blue planet, the thing that no Dominion analyst had thought to include in their mission briefing. They were remarkably good at setting aside their differences when something threatened all of them at once. The arguments and conflicts and divisions that filled their daily news cycles did not disappear, but they moved to the background with surprising speed. Within 24 hours, a unified emergency council had been formed. Representatives from nations that had not cooperated in years were sitting at the same table, looking at the same orbital data, asking the same calm and focused questions. The first question was, what is up there? The second question was, what do we do about it? Meanwhile, VTH Kalos had sent a scout pod to the surface to collect soil samples and assess the local environment. The pod landed in a wide flat field, surrounded by low hills and tall grass. A standard reconnaissance drone emerged and began its work. Dale Hutchins arrived at the field 12 minutes later in his old truck. He climbed out, looked at the pod sitting in the middle of his field with its lights blinking, and walked toward it without hesitating. When the scout drone turned and faced him, he looked directly into its optical sensor and crossed his arms. I don't know who sent you, he said in a tone that was completely calm and completely serious at the same time. But you have about 30 seconds to give me a very good reason why you're sitting in my field. The drone had not been programmed for this response. It had been programmed for hostile action, for running, for hiding. It had not been programmed for a human being in muddy boots who looked mildly annoyed and entirely unafraid. It stood still, uncertain, processing. Dale waited. Then when no answer came, he took action. He was practical by nature. The scout drone was recovered 2 hours later by a Dominion retrieval team. They found it zip tied to a wooden fence post at the edge of the field. Still blinking steadily, Dale was back inside his house, drinking coffee and watching the emergency broadcast on television. That evening, the Unified Human Council sent its first transmission toward the fleet in orbit. Pell received it, translated it carefully, and placed it on the commander's desk without a word. VTH Kalos read it. It was short, it was direct, it contained no threats, no dramatic language, and no requests for negotiation. It simply said, you have 24 hours to explain your presence and your actions in this system. This is a statement, not a request. We will be Waiting for your response. VTH Kalos read it twice, then he made a short dismissive sound and set it aside. They were a primitive civilization on a quarantined rock. They had no ships. They had no weapons capable of reaching orbit. They had nothing. He would deal with them when it suited him. He did not know because he had not read the full archive file the way Pell had at that exact moment, deep inside the oldest data vault in the Dominion capital. An ancient AI system had woken from a 12,000-year sleep. It had detected that its quarantine beacon had been passed without acknowledgement. It had checked its records. It had confirmed the coordinates of the violated system, and then it had sent a single automated message to VTH Kalos's personal command console. Commander, you have made a serious error. We are sorry for your fleet. VTH Kalos did not see the message until morning. By then the planet below was already changing. The message from the Elder Archive sat unread on V. Thalos's console for 6 hours. He had been busy. There were mineral surveys to review, crew reports to sign, and a long communication to send back to the Dominion Senate confirming that the mission was progressing on schedule. The quarantine system had been entered without incident. The third planet had been scanned. The deposits were rich and well positioned for extraction. Everything was going exactly as planned. When he finally sat down and opened the message, he read it twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of his cabin for a long moment. We are sorry for your fleet, he told himself. It was just an old automated system reacting to an old protocol. Machines did not understand context. They did not understand that thousands of years had passed, that the galaxy was different now, that whatever the original warning was meant to protect against was surely no longer relevant. He closed the message, stood up, and went back to the bridge. Pell was waiting for him. She had been waiting for him. He realized in the specific, quiet way she had when she wanted to say something important but was waiting to be asked. He had worked with her long enough to know the difference between her ordinary silence and this particular kind. What is it? He said. I would like you to read the full archive file, she said. Not the mission summary, the full file. I have read the mission summary. It covers everything necessary. It does not, Pell said. She said it quietly, without any challenge in her voice. Just as a fact, the full file is very different. I think you should read it before we take any further action on the surface. VTH Kalos looked at her for a moment, then he told her to send it to his console. He would look at it later. He had more pressing things to attend to. He did not look at it that day, but far away in the Capitol building of the Galactic Dominion, other people were looking at it very carefully indeed. The Senate had received VTH Kalos's progress report at the same time that the Elder Archive's automated alert had been flagged across several senior intelligence channels. A junior analyst named Saravias had been the first to cross-reference the two. She was young, methodical, and not yet experienced enough to dismiss things that made her uncomfortable. She pulled the full archive file on the quarantine system, made herself a warm drink, and started reading. She finished it 3 hours later. Then she walked directly to the office of Senior Archivist Dahlin, knocked on the door, and placed a printed copy of the file on his desk without saying anything. Dahlin read the first 2 pages, then he stood up and walked to the Senate chamber without stopping to put on his formal coat. The emergency session that followed was not calm. The younger senators argued loudly that the quarantine was ancient history, that the archive file was exaggerated, that Commander VTH Kalos had one of the strongest fleets in the Dominion, and there was nothing on that planet that could threaten it. The elder senators, the ones who had spent their careers studying the older records, the ones who had read about the period before the Dominion existed, did not argue back. They simply sat very still and waited for the noise to die down. Their silence said more than any words could. When the room finally quieted, the oldest senator on the council, a thin and ancient creature named Voreth, who rarely spoke in public sessions, folded his hands on the table and said in a very even voice that perhaps it would help everyone to understand what the archive file actually described. The file described this 12,000 years ago. The third planet in the quarantine system had not been a quiet and primitive world. It had been the home of a civilization that had already reached the stars. They had been space-faring for centuries before the KTH sovereignty, the empire that had existed before the Dominion had even made contact with them. They had built ships. They had explored the outer systems. They had made allies, established trade, and expanded their reach steadily and quickly. They had also fought 3 interstellar wars. In each war they had been the smaller side. In each war the opposing civilization had been older, better equipped, and more experienced in large-scale conflict. And in each war, the humans, as the archive called them, had won, not easily, not without great loss, but completely. In every case the war had ended with the other side seeking terms. In every case the humans had accepted those terms without cruelty, rebuilt what had been damaged, and gone home. The Keth sovereignty had studied these 3 wars very carefully. Their analysts had run projections, built models, and tried to identify exactly what it was that made these humans so difficult to defeat. The models kept returning the same answer, and it was not the answer the analysts had expected. It was not superior technology. It was not larger numbers. It was not even particularly brilliant strategy, though human strategists were very good. It was something simpler and far harder to counter. The humans did not stop. In conventional warfare, every civilization had a breaking point, a level of loss or pressure at which continued fighting became irrational, and retreat or surrender became the logical choice. Every military model in the galaxy was built on this principle. You applied enough force, caused enough damage, and eventually the other side would calculate that continuing was not worth it. That was how wars ended. Humans did not calculate it that way. When they took losses, they did not slow down. They rebuilt and came back. When a strategy stopped working, they did not retreat to regroup. They changed the strategy immediately and kept moving forward. When they were pushed to the edge, they did not break. They became more focused, more creative, and more determined than they had been before the pressure began. Every model the Keth sovereignty built to predict their behavior eventually failed because the models all assumed a breaking point that never arrived. The KE sovereignty launched a full military campaign against the humans before they could grow any stronger. The campaign was intended to be decisive and fast. It lasted 400 years. It ended when the Keth sovereignty sent a message asking for Peace, not because they had the humans. Surrounded, not because they had won some final decisive battle, they asked for peace because they were exhausted, all the way down to the structure of their civilization, and the humans were not the humans had been fighting for 4 centuries and were, if anything, better at it than when they had started. The peace agreement was negotiated carefully, the humans, in a move that still puzzled historians, offered to withdraw entirely. They agreed to have their space-faring technology disabled, their memory of galactic civilization gradually erased across generations, and their world placed under a long quarantine. In return, they asked simply to be left in peace. The KE sovereignty agreed within the same day. The archive noted in a short and almost casual line that several historians believed the humans had accepted this arrangement not out of exhaustion or defeat, but because they had grown bored. The war was no longer presenting new challenges. They had solved it. It was time to do something else. There was one final detail in the file, one line that Sarah had underlined when she first read it, and that now sat at the center of every conversation in the Senate chamber: the regression, the memory loss, the technological suppression had never been designed to be permanent. It was more like a long sleep than a death, and written clearly into the original treaty agreed upon by both sides was a single condition under which the sleep would end: external aggression on home territory. Vorth looked around the room when he finished reading that line aloud. No one spoke. Then Saravias, who had followed the senior archivist into the session and was standing quietly near the back wall, said in a small and careful voice, "The orbital bombardment already happened." The room stayed silent for a long time after that. Meanwhile, on the blue planet below, a retired aerospace engineer named Dr. Unipark woke at 3 in the morning from a deep and vivid dream she could not quite remember. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her apartment. Then, without fully understanding why, she got up, walked to her home office, and picked up a marker. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finally stepped back and looked at her whiteboard, it was covered from edge to edge in equations, diagrams, and design notes. Her hands were shaking slightly. She recognized parts of what she had written: standard physics, familiar mathematics, but the overall shape of it was something she had never studied, never read about, never been taught. It was a design for a faster-than-light propulsion system. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called a colleague she had not spoken to in 2 years. "I need you to come and look at something," she said. Her voice was quiet and very steady. "I think something has woken up inside me, and I do not think I am the only one." She was not. Across the planet, in dozens of cities, in hundreds of homes, other people were waking up with the same strange feeling. Something old and forgotten was surfacing. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time was beginning slowly and quietly to open its eyes. 6 months after the first bombardment, the planet below was unrecognizable. Not in the way a place looks after destruction, in the way a place looks when something that was sleeping inside it has finally stood up and stretched. The cities were the same, the roads and buildings and rivers were the same, but the energy moving through all of it had changed completely. There was a focus to everything now, a shared direction, as if hundreds of millions of separate People had all turned to face the same point at the same time. Pell watched the surface from the observation deck of the flagship every morning. She had started doing it without really deciding to. She would stand at the wide window with a cup of warm liquid and look down at the swirling clouds over the blue-green surface and try to understand what she was seeing in the data feeds coming from the long-range scanners. Construction was happening at dozens of sites simultaneously. Energy output across the planet had increased by a significant amount. Just a few months, new structures were appearing in remote areas, large flat, reinforced structures that the Dominion's pattern recognition systems kept trying to classify and kept failing. They looked like launch platforms. She brought this to VTH Kalos. He looked at the scans, dismissed them as industrial expansion, and reminded her that the humans had no knowledge of space flight. They were a pre-conned civilization, whatever they were building. It was not a threat to a fleet. In high orbit, Pell went back to her console and said nothing, but she quietly began keeping a personal log of everything the scanners recorded. She had a feeling she would want a detailed record later. She was not sure why. It was just a feeling. The truth of what was happening on the surface was both simpler and more extraordinary than any Dominion analyst could have guessed. It was not a single government program or a brilliant scientist working in a secret laboratory. It was not organized in any way that made immediate sense from the outside. It was simply people, ordinary, everyday people, waking up in the morning with knowledge they had not gone to sleep with. A factory worker in a large industrial city sat down during his break, picked up a pen, and drew a detailed schematic for an energy conversion unit he had never studied. Young woman studying at a coastal university filled 6 notebooks in a single weekend with mathematics she had never been taught, then spent 2 days double-checking the work and finding it was all correct. A retired military engineer in a cold northern country woke from a long, strange dream and immediately began drawing hull plating designs that were lighter and stronger than anything currently in production. It was everywhere, and it was accelerating whatever had been suppressed in the human mind 12,000 years ago was coming back, the way water comes back when a blocked pipe is suddenly opened, not slowly, not cautiously, but all at once, with great force and without apology. The Unified Emergency Council, which had been meeting daily since the first bombardment, was receiving reports from every corner of the planet. Scientists and engineers and builders were coming forward with new ideas at a rate that was impossible to track. The council made a practical decision early on. Rather than trying to manage all of it from the top, they would create a simple, open system where anyone with a useful idea could submit it, where teams could form around the best ideas quickly, and where resources would be distributed based on what was actually working, rather than on rank or status. It was a messy system. It generated enormous arguments. It also moved at a speed that would have been impossible under any more controlled approach. The scout pod that Dale Hutchins had captured in his field was sitting in a government research facility 2 weeks after the council was formed. Within 11 weeks, a team of engineers drawn from 6 countries with backgrounds ranging from aerospace to farming equipment repair had taken it apart completely, understood how every piece of it worked, and begun building a version of its propulsion system from materials available on Earth. They did not get it right on the first try or the third, but by the time 4 months had passed, they had a working engine. By the end of 5 months, they had functional shields built around the same principles as the ones on the Dominion fleet in orbit. By the end of 6 months, they had weapons, and the mood in the research facilities had shifted from urgent to something quieter and more serious. VTH Kalos, who had by now received a very firm message from the Senate recommending extreme caution, decided instead to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. He selected a cluster of communication satellites in high orbit and ordered them destroyed. It was a controlled action, he told himself. Demonstration of capability, a reminder of the difference in power between a spacefaring empire and a planet that had only just rediscovered basic propulsion. 3 human technicians who had been performing maintenance aboard one of the satellites were killed in the strike. The Human Council's response came within 4 hours. It was not emotional, it was not dramatic. It was a short, precise statement that named the 3 people who had died, stated clearly that this action was considered an act of aggression against human lives, and informed the fleet that the Council considered itself to be in a state of active conflict with the Galactic Dominion as of that moment. Then it got very quiet on all communication channels. Pell read the statement 3 times. The tone of it frightened her more than any threat would have. There was no anger in it. There was no fear. There was just a calm, clear line being drawn, and on the other side of that line something very focused was preparing to move. She made her decision. That same night, Saravias had been an archivist in the Dominion's military intelligence division for 4 years. She was not a soldier. She was not a hero. She was a careful, precise, somewhat anxious creature who had spent most of her career reading old documents in quiet rooms, but she had read the full archive file. She had been in the Senate chamber when Vorath read out the wake condition, and she had watched for 6 months as every warning in that file came true one by one, while the commander of her fleet dismissed each one in turn. She packed a small bag, wrote a short note explaining her decision, and boarded an emergency escape pod. She aimed it at the surface of the planet below and launched before she could change her mind. The pod shook violently during descent, and she spent the entire journey with her eyes closed and her hands gripping the safety restraints, wondering if she had just made the last decision of her life. She crash-landed in a flat, cold, rocky landscape that she later learned was called Iceland. The impact was hard, enough to knock her briefly unconscious. When she opened her eyes, gray sky was visible through the cracked pod window, and several humans in heavy coats were standing outside looking at her with expressions that were curious rather than hostile. She was helped out of the pod, wrapped in a thick blanket, and given a warm drink that smelled strange, but was genuinely comforting. Then she was driven to a low building where a calm, well-dressed human man was waiting for her at a table with 2 chairs. His name was Ambassador Cheney. He introduced himself simply, asked if she needed anything else before they talked, and then waited. He did not rush her. He did not raise his voice. He sat with the easy patience of someone who had all the time in the world, which Saravias found more unnerving than any aggressive Questioning would have been, she told him, everything she knew: the archive file, the Senate session, the wake condition, the full size of the Dominion fleet. She explained that what VTH Kalos commanded was a scouting force, a small advance element. The full Dominion military numbered over 4,000 warships. She wanted him to understand the scale of what was coming. Cheney listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then he folded his hands on the table and said, calmly and without any obvious emotion, "That is useful to know. We were concerned this might be resolved too quickly." Sarah stared at him. She had expected fear. She had expected the information about 4,000 warships to produce some visible reaction, alarm or urgency, or at the very least a change. In his expression, there was nothing, just that same quiet, steady attention. She spent the rest of the day sitting in a small room with a window that looked out onto a gray and windy landscape, drinking warm drinks and wondering in a very sincere way whether defecting had been the right choice after all. 3 weeks later, the first human spacecraft launched. It had started life as a cargo freighter, a large, blocky, deeply unglamorous vehicle that had spent its working years moving industrial equipment between ports. Its crew had stripped it down to the frame, reinforced the hull with the new plating designs, fitted 6 rail cannons to the exterior at angles that no professional military designer would have approved, and installed the new propulsion system in a space that was frankly too small for it. The whole thing looked exactly like what it was, something built very fast by people who were determined and creative and not particularly worried about how it looked. The crew of 11 who volunteered to fly it were a mixture of former military pilots, engineers, and one farmer from Montana who had, in the month since zip-tying an alien drone to a fence post, become something of a public figure. His name was Dale Hutchkins. He had been asked quite formally if he would like to be part of the first crew. He had said yes without hesitating, then gone home to feed his horses and pack a bag. The crew named the ship before launch. They painted the name on the hull in large, bold, cheerful letters, "The Stubborn Bastard." The council had raised an objection to the name on grounds of professionalism. The crew had listened politely and kept the name. The Stubborn Bastard launched on a clear morning and reached the outer system in a matter of hours. 2 Dominion warships were running a patrol route near the edge of the solar system. They detected the human vessel on their long-range scans and identified it immediately as a primitive improvised craft. The patrol commander sent a brief, dismissive note to the flagship and moved to intercept. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, both Dominion warships were drifting and disabled. The Stubborn Bastard had taken damage to its port side, and one of its cannons was no longer working. The crew were intact. Dale Hutchkins, who had been operating the targeting system, sent a short message back to the surface that became, within hours, one of the most repeated phrases on the planet. 2 down. Tell them to send more. On the Dominion flagship, VTH Kalos stared at the engagement report for a very long time without speaking. Then he walked to his private cabin, sat down at his console, and finally, 6 months later than he should have, opened the full archive file. He read it from beginning to end without stopping. When he finished, he sat in the silence of his cabin and looked at the wall. Outside the window, the beautiful blue-green planet turned. Slowly in the dark, he understood now. What Pell had been trying to tell him, he understood what the signs at the edge of the system had meant. He understood why no one had entered this system in 10,000 years, and he understood with a cold and sinking certainty that he had no idea what to do next. 2 years after the first bombardment, the Galactic Dominion sent everything it had. The order came directly from the Senate after weeks of heated debate. The elder senators had argued against it. Voreth had stood at the front of the chamber and spoken for a long time about patience, about the archive file, about the specific and well-documented reasons why direct military escalation against this particular planet was historically a very poor idea. The younger senators had listened, considered his words carefully, and then voted for escalation. Anyway, they had numbers on their side. They had confidence on their side, and they had, in their opinion, more than enough ships. 4,200 warships gathered at the edge of the quarantine zone. They formed up in a long layered formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. It was the largest military assembly the Dominion had organized in 3,000 years. Supply ships moved along the edges of the formation. Medical vessels and repair units took up positions at the rear. Troop carriers held ground forces, ready for surface operations once the orbital engagement was finished. Every projection, every model, every military analyst who reviewed the assembled force agreed on one thing: this would be over quickly. The human fleet that rose to meet them numbered 600 ships when the Dominion's long-range sensors confirmed that figure. There was genuine confusion. On several bridges, the analysts ran the count twice, then a third time. 600 against 4,200. The ratio was so wide that some commanders initially wondered if the humans were planning something other than a direct engagement, a distraction. Perhaps while something else happened elsewhere. But the 600 ships came forward steadily and without hesitation on a direct intercept course, and after a short time it became clear that no, this was simply what the humans had chosen to bring. What followed became known later as the Battle of the Hewitt Line, named for the distant shell of rock and ice at the very outer edge of the solar system, where the two fleets first made contact. It lasted 11 days. It was not the short and clean engagement the Dominion's planners had prepared for. In the first 2 days, the Dominion's advantage numbers was clear and significant. Human ships were hit hard, formations were broken apart, several of the larger human vessels were destroyed in the opening exchanges, and the Dominion commanders watching the engagement feeds felt the steady, comfortable confidence of a force doing exactly what it had trained to do. The projection said the human fleet would reach critical losses by day 3 and begin withdrawal by day 4. Day 3 came. The human fleet did not withdraw. It reorganized. This was the part that began to unsettle the Dominion officers watching from the command ships. When a human formation was broken up by a Dominion strike, the surviving ships did not drift or scatter or wait for orders from a command vessel. They found each other. They formed new groups. They identified the nearest Dominion ships and engaged them immediately, using whatever they had available, adapting their approach based on what was directly in front of them. rather than waiting for a plan to come down from above. When a human command ship was destroyed, and several were in those first difficult days, the ships around it did not hesitate or lose coordination. They simply continued. Loss was real and it mattered, but it did not create the collapse of structure that the Dominion's models predicted. The humans had built their fleet to function without central command. If central command was removed, they had planned for their own losses before the battle began. By day 5, the Dominion commanders had stopped consulting their projections. The projections kept being wrong, and consulting them was becoming more frustrating than useful. On day 6, a human tactic appeared that no Dominion analyst had modeled. A large portion of the human fleet, roughly a third of the remaining ships, began pulling back, not in a disorganized retreat but in a controlled, deliberate withdrawal that drew a significant section of the Dominion fleet forward and away from the main formation. Dominion commanders read it as a break in human resolve. The order was given to press the advantage and pursue. The pursuing force flew for several hours in what felt like a clean chase. Then from 6 different directions, human ships that had been running dark and silent in the surrounding space came alive all at once. The trap closed from every side. Simultaneously, the pursuing Dominion force found itself in the center of a prepared killing zone that had been set up hours before the retreat began, in positions that would have required precise coordination and a willingness to commit a large number of ships to a passive waiting role during the most intense part of the battle. It was a strategy that required something very specific from the people who used it. It required them to accept serious losses in the short term to allow their own ships to be hit and destroyed during the retreat phase, in full confidence that the long-term outcome would justify it. Every military model in the Dominion's database rated the probability of this kind of tactic from a smaller force at less than 1%. The models assumed that no rational commander would order their own people into a punishing retreat as part of a deliberate plan. The models had been built without understanding the specific psychology of the species they were facing. VTH Silo stood on his bridge on the 8th day and watched the display in front of him with the expression of a creature who had understood something too late. His fleet was not broken. It was still large and still fighting, but it was no longer in control of the engagement in any meaningful way. Everywhere his commanders tried to press an advantage, they found it turning against them. Everywhere they expected the humans to bend, the humans held. Everywhere they created a gap, something came through it that made the gap worse. Saravas was standing in the human command center on the surface of the planet, watching the same battle from the other side. She stood beside Ambassador Chen Wei at a long display table covered in moving tactical data, and she watched the feeds with wide eyes and very still hands. She had known intellectually what the archive file said about human warfare. She had read the words, she had understood them as facts on a page, but watching it happen in real time was something entirely different. She turned to Chen Wei and spoke quietly. Every other species, when it goes to war, asks whether it can win. She said, your people ask how long it will take. It is a completely different question. I did not understand what that meant until right now. Chen Wei looked at the display for a moment before answering. Losing is not something we spend much time planning for, he said. Simply, then he picked up his communication device and went back to work. By day 9, the Dominion fleet had lost nearly a third of its ships. Not all destroyed, many were damaged and withdrawn or cut off from the main formation and unable to rejoin. Effectively, the fleet was still large. It still had the numbers, but the commanders were tired in a way that went beyond physical rest, and the humans showed no sign of the same tiredness. If anything, as the days passed, the human fleet's coordination seemed to improve, as if the battle itself was teaching them and they were learning faster than the Dominion could adapt. On day 10, VTH Kalos made a decision. He could see that the main engagement was not going to produce the result the Senate had promised, but the planet was still there. The surface was still, as far as his sensors could tell, undefended from direct orbital bombardment. If he could strike the planet itself, not a test pulse this time, but a real strike that demonstrated the true cost of continued resistance, the humans would have to respond. They would have to pull back their fleet to defend their home, and in that moment of repositioning, the Dominion could regain control of the engagement. He selected 12 of his fastest remaining warships, the ones least damaged by 11 days of combat, and sent them on a course that swung wide around the edges of the battle and aimed straight for the third planet. The 12 ships moved at full speed. They passed the outer edges of the solar system. They crossed the distances between the outer planets. They came around the curve of the system star, and the blue-green planet came into view on their screens, close and clear and growing larger with every passing minute. What they found when they reached orbit was not what VTH Kalos had planned for. In 2 years, the humans had not only built a fleet, they had also turned their planet into a fortress. The surface was covered in layered defense systems, ground-based weapons that reached into orbit with a range and precision that the incoming ship sensors detected only seconds before they opened fire. The 12 warships had been built for combat against other ships in open space. They had not been designed for what came up at them from the surface in the first 30 seconds of their arrival. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it was over, all 12 ships were gone, not retreating, not damaged and withdrawing. Gone. VTH Kalos received the report on his bridge. He read it. He set it down. He asked his bridge crew to give him a moment alone, which they did without question, because every one of them had seen his face when he read the report, and none of them wanted to be in the room. He sat alone in the quiet of the bridge and thought about the archive file he had finally read 3 weeks ago. He thought about the 400-year war. He thought about the Keth sovereignty, asking for peace, not because they were defeated, but because they were simply finished. He thought about the line in the file that described why the humans had agreed to the quarantine. They had been bored. The war was no longer a challenge. He looked at his fleet strength data. He looked at the losses from 11 days of battle. He looked at the report from the 12 ships he had just sent to the planet's surface, and then he opened a direct personal channel to the Dominion Senate, not an official military report, not a formatted status update, but a direct message from one individual to the people who had sent him here. He wrote 4 words and sent it: offer them the peace. Then he closed the channel, leaned back in his chair and looked out through the wide viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, 600 human ships were still fighting. Somewhere behind him, a planet he had woken from a 12,000-year sleep was watching everything. With calm, clear eyes, he had read the file too late. He had understood the warning too late, but he understood it now completely and without any remaining doubt. The most dangerous thing about them was not their weapons or their ships or their tactics. It was that when you pushed them, they became better. Every loss sharpened them. Every setback taught them something. Every challenge they faced made the next challenge slightly easier for them to handle. You could not wear them down. You could not make them afraid. You could only make them more capable, and he had given them 2 full years to practice. The message reached the Dominion Senate in the middle of the night. 4 words: no explanation, no military data attached, no formal structure of any kind, just 4 words from the commander of the largest fleet the Dominion had assembled in 3,000 years, sent through a private channel in the quiet hours when most of the Senate building was dark and empty. Offer them the peace. The night staff who received it sat with it for 20 minutes before deciding to wake Vorath. They chose him because he was the one who had warned them. They chose him because of all the people in the Senate. He was the one who had read the file and understood it and said so out loud when it still might have made a difference. They knocked on the door of his private quarters, handed him the printed message and waited. He read it once. Then he nodded slowly, the way a person nods when something they expected to happen has finally happened. He told them to call an emergency session for first light. Then he went back inside and did not sleep again that night. The session the next morning was different from every session that had come before it. The arguing was mostly gone. The confidence that had filled the chamber 2 years earlier when the fleet was being assembled and the projections were being cited and the elder senators were being politely ignored had drained away completely. What remained was a room full of tired, sober creatures who had spent 2 years watching their most powerful military force grind slowly to a halt against a planet that had started the conflict. With no ships at all, the vote to pursue peace negotiations was not close. Finding neutral ground for the talks took 3 weeks. A small station orbiting a quiet and unremarkable star equidistant from Earth in the Dominion capital was selected and prepared. Medical staff were stationed there. Catering was arranged. A large formal meeting room was set up with a long table, many chairs, and excellent lighting. The Dominion delegation that arrived filled most of those chairs. There were senior senators, military advisors, legal specialists, diplomatic translators, and a security team that occupied its own separate section of the station. The total Dominion party numbered just over 200 individuals. The human delegation arrived the following morning. There were 3 of them. They came aboard the station without a visible security escort, without a long list of advisors, and without any particular ceremony. They were dressed simply and neatly. They walked through the corridors of the station at a comfortable pace, looking around with open and relaxed curiosity, and took their seats at the table with the ease of people settling in for a meeting they had scheduled themselves. One of them poured water from a jug into 3 cups and passed one to each of his colleagues before anyone else in the room had spoken a word. The 200 members of the Dominion delegation watched this in complete silence. Several of them later described the same feeling in their personal accounts of the event, a deep and specific unease that had nothing to do with any visible threat and everything to do with the quiet certainty that radiated from three people sitting calmly on the opposite side of a table, a security advisor in the Dominion Party wrote in his notes that evening that he had spent his entire career assessing danger and that he had never in his life felt less certain about a room than he did in that moment. Ambassador Chen Wei led the talks. He was the same man who had sat across from Saravias in Iceland 2 years earlier and offered her warm drinks and patient conversation. He brought the same quality to the negotiating table, a complete and unshakable stillness, a willingness to listen to everything, and an absolute clarity about what he would and would not accept. The Dominion's opening proposal was detailed and carefully constructed. It covered fleet limitations, territorial boundaries, schedule for human technological development that would keep expansion at a manageable rate, and a reformed quarantine arrangement that was described in the legal language of the document as a mutual protective measure for both parties. Cheney listened to the full presentation without interrupting. When it was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he thanked the presenting senator for the thoroughness of the proposal and began point by point to decline every condition that placed a limit on humanity's freedom to move, build, expand, or defend itself. He did it without raising his voice. He did it without visible frustration or impatience. He simply made clear in plain and direct language what was acceptable and what was not, and nothing in his manner suggested that any amount of further argument was going to change those positions. The talks lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, both sides signed. The agreement was called the UIT Accord, named for the place where the battle had been fought. It was not written in the language of a surrender. It was not a list of restrictions imposed on a defeated side. It was a membership document, a formal agreement that welcomed humanity into the galactic community as a full and equal partner with all the rights and responsibilities that came with that standing. No fleet limits, no expansion schedule, no quarantine reformed or otherwise. What it did include was a mutual defense clause, a framework for trade and communication, and a shared commitment to peaceful resolution of future disputes. It was, in several important ways, a better agreement for both parties than anything the original Dominion proposal had contained. Several member species of the Dominion sent quiet diplomatic messages to Earth before the ink on the accord was even fully dry. Everyone understood which way the balance in the galaxy had shifted, and everyone wanted to be standing on the right side of it going forward. VTH Kalos attended the signing at Chen Wei's personal request. He had been brought to the station not as a prisoner, not under guard, but as an invited guest. He sat near the back of the room and watched the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who has been part of a significant event and is trying to understand exactly what it meant. He looked older than he had 2 years ago, smaller somehow, not diminished exactly, but changed in the way that certain experiences change a person permanently. After the documents were signed and the room had begun to empty, Chen Wei crossed the floor and stopped in front Of him, he extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting and respect that VTH Klo had studied but never experienced directed at him personally. VTH Klo shook it. "Why did you want me here?" he asked. His voice was steady but genuine. He truly wanted to know. Chen Wei considered the question for a moment. "Because you were the beginning of this," he said. "Whatever this becomes, the trade, the cooperation, the conversations we are going to have with the rest of the galaxy, it starts from the moment you flew past those signs. You made a mistake, but the result of that mistake, at least from where I am standing, is not a bad one." He paused. "The universe is a more interesting place than it was 3 years ago. You deserve to see how this chapter begins." V. Thalos had no answer for that. He stood with Chen Wei's words settling over him and looked around the room at Dominion senators talking with human diplomats, at Saravia standing near the window in conversation with a young human engineer, at all the different species and faces and languages filling the same space without tension. And he thought that perhaps the old archivist in him could appreciate, in spite of everything, that he had witnessed something genuinely rare, a new chapter written in a room with good lighting and a long table and 3 cups of water poured with quiet confidence by people who had never doubted, not for a single moment, how the story would end, far away in the oldest vault in the Dominion capital building, in a room that had not been entered by any living person in longer than most civilizations had existed. The Elder Archive AI completed its update. It worked through its records methodically, the way it always had. It removed the quarantine flag from the system's coordinates. It cleared the dormancy classification. It updated the contact status and the diplomatic standing and the military rating. It moved through each field carefully and correctly, as it had done with thousands of species over thousands of years. Then it reached the final field, the one at the bottom of the file that most species never received an entry in at all, and it wrote the last line of the record. It saved the file. It closed the record. It returned to its quiet work among the deep stacks of history. The final entry read: species human home world SAW system. Status active. Classification apex. Diplomatic standing ally. Note for all future civilizations making first contact with this species. Congratulations, you have awakened the most dangerous creature in the universe. It does not want to destroy you. It wants to shake your hand. The important thing, the only thing that matters, is that you reach out first.